I should really have thanked privately before I do it publicly, but I'll do it publicly now, is Peter Bruce, who had enormous respect for me as a lighty. I was hardly back from England, arrived inexperienced, and he saw something in me. He allowed me to be hired into Business Day, literally to come and debate with them on a daily basis what the editorial should be for the next day. I wrote a lot of their editorials in my 20s. And he then also gave me my first column.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And in this episode, I'd like to pay tribute to Eusebius Mkhwanazi, author, broadcaster, analyst, most importantly to me, a very good friend. And for South Africa, I think one of the most important political voices of our generation, who tragically passed away recently, and very painfully and very suddenly for those close to him, and also for the South African media landscape, its fraternity and its sorority. So I just want to pay tribute to Eusebius in this episode, maybe tell you some things that you might not know about Eusebius, and also talk about some of my fondest memories with him. And then I'll also just take some of the extracts from our conversations on SMWX together, because over the next few years, I'm sure many people will look into the political thought and the writing of Eusebius, and I think those writings will live for a long time. But he didn't do a lot of interviews. He was very selective about the interviews he did, and he was very gracious to come on SMWX 4 times. And we had really long-form conversations, which was quite rare for him. And I think he expounded on a lot of ideas and concepts, which I think will also live for a long time. So I'd like to draw some of what he said out for you, the audience, because I think here on SMWX, we're building an important archive of thinkers and conversations that will hopefully live long. So to Eusebius, who was a dear friend, he was someone that I definitely looked up to in a major way. He was one of the first Black South Africans to go to Oxford in the democratic era. And of course, like that seemed like a very faraway dream for many people, but seeing him go to Oxford was a major inspiration to me. He had no idea who I was at the time, but I was always looking at, who got the Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford? And then I would like investigate who those people were. And everyone knew Eusebius as like someone who got admitted to do a PhD in philosophy at Oxford. And that was just like out of this world. So my first memory of reading his work was he wrote a short story while he was in Oxford. That was just really fascinating. It was about all these different things, but particularly it was about like the stigma that was associated with HIV/AIDS at the time. And I was just like, I just thought the short story was so brilliantly written. Then I eventually got the opportunity and the chance to be interviewed by Eusebius when he started hosting a show on Power FM. And I was like, wow, I'm finally going to get to meet Eusebius for the first time. And that's where we met. He interviewed me, disagreed with a lot of the things I said. But I was just happy to have met him and to come into contact with him. So I was just glad to have met him at that interview. But then I went to Oxford. And while I was there, I released a song called Mr. President. Check it out. It was something that Eusebius then wrote to me about. And he was like, I listened to your song. It was really interesting. When you get back to South Africa for your holidays, come on the show and let's talk about it. And I want to profile you. And you can imagine I was like, wow, the great Eusebius has now invited me to an interview. And that was just a mark of his generosity, because one of the things he constantly did was he took people who were younger than he was and elevated them, gave them a platform. And there are many people like that who he really raised and used his platform to build. Now, when I came for that profile interview on Power FM on his show, and his Power FM show was quite a culturally important show as well, I was really struck by the work ethic. So let me give you an example of what he did. Normally, even I have to say, eye sometimes, because you have so many different interviews. You know, you can think about it maybe for 1 day or 2 days, get your questions. What he did was he was like, okay, you're going to go for coffee with my producer. And then my producer is going to ask you a bunch of questions. And then she's going to record that. So there's going to be like a pre-interview with my producer. And then I will listen back to the conversation you had with my producer. And then I will craft my questions for the interview based on that. He didn't have to do any of that, right? Normally TV, radio, it's just you come into studio, the person thinks of whatever they want to ask and they ask it. But he was so dedicated to his craft that he would do this pre-interview thing with his producer. And I was like, wow, I'd never seen that before. So that's one of my fond memories about his excellence and his dedication to excellence in the media space. What I wanted to do with this episode, though, in paying tribute to him, was just to pay tribute to some of his political ideas, which I think are really important, which we should be revisiting regularly. And there are 3 themes that he spoke about on SMWX, which I'd like to focus on. So first, there's no denying that Eusebius was a fierce critic of those in power. And he wasn't afraid to criticize government and corruption, and he was very unapologetic about that. So I'd like to first give you a sample of some of the things he said about our country, the state our country is in at the moment, and his analysis of that, and also the way that he would be unapologetically criticizing the people in power. And we'll take a clip from our most recent interview. So have a look at this, how he diagnosed our situation and how unapologetic and brave he was about criticizing the most powerful in our country. A deeper debate going on right now about the consequences for the country. And the consequences are not just limited to the short-term consequences, as you say. I think a lot of people who are on the side that, well, let's just keep him on, are looking at the short-term consequences. The rand may depreciate.
What will DD do?
Exactly. DD may become president. But then there's the question of what are the long-term consequences of setting this precedent? What are the consequences that stretch into the decades or many, many presidencies in advance? And for me, that case seems much stronger or transcends the short-term pain. I'm prepared, and I think it's probably disingenuous to say there won't be negative short-term consequences.
For sure, yeah.
There may well be.
Yeah.
But the question is, are we going to privilege short-term stability over setting a very dangerous long-term precedent that presidents can do things which seem impeachable, but if we like them, then they can basically do whatever they want.
Sizwe, I think that's right. I think we also need to take one step back, right? Because there's overlapping, shared background stuff in this conversation that I think not everyone, I think a lot of your viewers would share it, but we've got to make it explicit for the dispassionate viewer that may not be sure whether assumptions in our conversation so far are true or not. So let's lift them to the surface. The truth of the matter is that South Africa currently is in a massive crisis under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa. So when we talk about short-term pain, we must not pretend as if the status quo is painless.
Yes.
Which is why a book, even a book such as Jacques Pauw's latest book, is critically important. And as I said in my review of that book, the least interesting part is the excerpts around the EFF and the titillating stuff about them having parties, etc.
Sure.
The part of that book for me that is the most interesting, which is everything that comes before the EFF, which only happens at page 350, is that he reminds us how President Cyril Ramaphosa has kept the president's keepers.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we mean President Jacob Zuma's keepers. So instead of showing, for example, that he has the leadership mettle to get rid of people who are corrupt, who have been found wanting, like Arthur Fraser, or an intelligence minister like Siyabonga Mkhwanazi, you find that suddenly they become ambassadors, or they become a DG in correctional services, or they get rearranged within the NPA, within the Hawks, within the SAPs. And lo and behold, if you look into the details, you will find some dodgy former cop is still dodgy in eThekwini, and his entire family as overnight, and I couldn't believe these are real examples, has suddenly be employed as lieutenants, as generals, what, and they're actually just sitting at home and getting passive income from the state, right? And on top of that, as you know, we're in a situation where the economy is not growing. Millions of black South Africans don't have a stake in either the democracy or in the economy. And you have a situation where under President Ramaphosa's watch, you've got the uprisings that happened last year in Gauteng and in KZN, and there's no intelligence capacity because he never showed the political leadership to be able to turn around the NPA, the Hawks, the SEPs, crime intelligence, and that's quite apart from the economic clusters. That is a disaster. For President Cyril Ramaphosa, becoming president was a bucket list item, but he's actually been at best mediocre, and at worst he's been implicated first as deputy president, saying nothing, while a lot of state capture happened under his watch. And then as president, he hasn't shown definitive leadership. Even in this moment, is undecided. Now, the reason why I am summarizing that is just to remind the person that has been living on another planet or who is so caught in the grip of Ramaphosa leftover sentiment that when we talk about short-term pain, you and I, we mustn't pretend as if 2 days ago South Africa was a stable country. We've had the politicization of the criminal justice system, at best technical incompetence. We've got assassinations inside the SEPs. We've got the cliffing of good career cops, whether it be IPID, the head of crime intelligence, our country's most important expert on gangs have been conveniently sidelined, Jeremy Veery. And so you can stack up the details of leadership incompetence under Cyril Ramaphosa. And so when someone says, well, you know what, money was just stolen from the guy's farm, let's not be disproportionate in what we think the punishment ought to be for not even him doing something wrong, but something wrong that was done to him. That is empirically a false description of the presidency of Mr. Ramaphosa. And if someone were to write the Ramaphosa years and really do an analytical job of describing and then assessing what he was like as president, even before Arthur Fraser went to the SAPS, I think he comes out looking quite mediocre. And the reason I wanted to mention that is that when people do up this kind of weighing, oh my God, what would life be under Didi? Please be mindful of the fact that life under Ramaphosa is terrible.
So that was really interesting. I mean, to not only call for a whole resignation, and also to say, like, in the media space, it's often that you say, well, this is the one side of the story, but this is the other side. But in some moments, you actually have to say, despite the two sides, this is the right side. I think that's a really important thing. And also just to say, look, yes, we are in a hot mess. There's no denial about that. And we can't keep giving a second chance just because of the end of apartheid and the end of racism. And, you know, we need to look at where we are right now. I think that was always a strong thing that he said. The second theme that he spoke on the channel, which I found interesting, was that we didn't always agree, but he was an intimidating person to debate against. So I remember us going out for lunch one day and he said, cool, we started talking about the Constitution. Is the Constitution all it's cracked up to be, or should the Constitution, you know, be scrapped? And that major debate. And we started talking about it. And then after our conversation, he was like, you know what? Let's have a thing on our show, on one of our shows, and let's actually have this, but let's frame it as a debate rather than just a conversation. And when Eusebius says to you, I want to debate with you in public, that was a scary idea, but it was also just a way of him saying, like, let's discuss our disagreements in public as equals, and let's show people that you don't always have to agree, and you can have productive debates about the future of South Africa, because none of us is always right about what's happening. And so listen to this segment of what I think is one of the most interesting defenses of the Constitution, and the way that Eusebius delineated between what the different parts of the Constitution are, and how he set out his side of the debate. Because I think it's a really brilliant exhibition in just first clarifying what you mean before you even start. So check this out on the Constitution.
in the public space, I think there are two interesting questions. One question is the Constitution the right vision for the country? A separate question is, would changing the constitutional text make a difference to the justice project?
So it seems to me that the Constitution is saying we come from a bad place, and this Constitution now marks a crucial departure point from that place and is in some ways the opposite of the bad place that we came from. The bad place is never named, and then I would agree with you. It seems that there are three key values which underpin all the remaining rights and opportunities that are afforded to the citizens as a result of those values, and that's human dignity, equality, and freedom. And it seems to me that you can almost read the Constitution through the prism of those three key values, for lack of a better term. So bad place, we're going to a new place, and in order to get there, everything has to be based on dignity, equality, and freedom.
I think that's right. I was thinking, though, that notwithstanding overlapping consensus between you and me about aspects of the constitutional text and constitutionalism that haven't succeeded in getting us to a just society. I mean, I think the easiest part of this dialogue is going to be agreeing on the gap between the Constitution and empirical reality. Anyone who thinks the Constitution has delivered justice is living in cloud cuckoo land or in Santon. And that's just for me a complete non-starter. Where you and I will disagree later is the extent to which the Constitution is an important part of the diagnosis of the problem. But to come back to this first question, and I really hope that our viewers and listeners are enjoying not rushing to the question of, is the Constitution a problem? And can changing it be part of the solution in a meaningful way? The question of the vision is a really interesting one. I think there's more to be said, and feel free to push back. There's more to be said appreciatively about the constitutional text than I think you give it credit for. Firstly, you are right about the vagueness problem. But I think good legal interpretation scholars agree necessarily that it is intrinsic to language that there will always be a vagueness problem. There wouldn't be a need for legal adjudication if ordinary language sufficed to understand all rights in all sources of law, not just the Constitution as a text, but also other statutes. If we take, for example, a matter involving a relative of yours today, the Criminal Procedure Act is subject to a day-long back and forth between the state and lawyers for the former President Jacob Zuma. Why? Because it's not.
I'm not related to Advocate Breitenbach. So.
Touché. And why is that the case? Because statutes are written in natural language. Natural language is both lucid, but is also subject to interpretation. So that's a quasi-defense on the vagueness issue. And I agree there's vagueness. I just don't think it's unique to us. I don't even think it's unique to the Constitution. I think it is intrinsic in all sources of law, and that's how legal adjudication arises as a discipline in the first place. But I concede it. I just think you are harsh about what to do with that fact. For example, as a philosophy student, one of the vagueness elements that always fascinated me is dignity. You find in case law, and I challenge lawyers who hate us non-lawyers engaging in these issues to respond to what I'm about to say and to prove me to be wrong with citation of case law. If you were to do a deep dive into the appearance of those three foundational values definitionally in our case law, Sizwe, you will find that there's no self-standing definition of dignity that doesn't reference either freedom or equality. But if you then go and you do a deep dive into the appearance definitionally of the concept of equality and substantive equality in particular in our case law, it constantly refers back to dignity.
But my point is not that it's one or the other. My point is that what we need is both. We need an effective state and constitutional enablement at the same time in order to tackle this kind of problem.
So let me say a couple of things. Firstly, like you, I don't like the word and the concept to the extent that the concept is clear, and I'm not sure it is, non-racialism. I think if you are genuinely committed to racial justice, you should frame it as a commitment to anti-racism. I prefer that language for reasons I've said elsewhere, but it's worth reiterating it a million times until it becomes trite. Anti is a more active bit of language. Non doesn't suggest that I am using my energies deliberately, intentionally to oppose something. Racism
Sure. Yeah.
is a fundamental oppressive system. Racialism, on some definitions, may simply, for example, refer to phenotype. And I'd rather know that if you are in the business of racial justice, that you are committed to putting it all together, actively and intentionally taking steps in community with others to eliminate the oppressive system of racism, its most obvious manifestation being white supremacy. The language of non-racialism, for me, doesn't capture that. South Africans who are older than both you and me don't like our critique, which is perhaps one we should have on your platform or mine on another occasion. There are many people who share broadly your politics and mine, but who think that we don't pay sufficient attention to the historical movements, for example, mass democratic movement in the 80s, who had a robust, clear understanding of non-racialism, and that we shouldn't be annoyed by the misappropriation of the DA. I get that. But like you, I think it's worth asking, even if something served us well in the 80s, can we recognize that perhaps a new language is needed, even if some of the old politics is retained, because the old language is misappropriated in ways that you must pay attention to and not romanticize more accurate usage in the past that is gone. I am on board with that.
Yeah.
There, you and I are totally on the same wavelength. Where we part ways, you know my view because we're friends, but for the public to get a sense of where you and I part ways, and my view is very simple here. The state and other actors like business or powerful individuals who've got privilege and power have the burden to bring about a just South Africa. A text is just words. What you've reminded me of, which is kind of obvious, but in a deep sense, there's a lot to be said for this obviousness, is that if I overstate my position, then I'm implying that the text doesn't matter at all. And you are right that the text does matter. So what the text says is critically important. Otherwise, we may as well not have a text. That you've convinced me of. What I'm less persuaded by is that if we change the text to be a bit more specific in the preamble, that we are trying to undo the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, that we are fighting for racial justice, that we are anti-patriarchy, anti-racism, I can't see how that will make Cyril Ramaphosa less useless tomorrow.
Now, a funny story about that episode of SMWX. Yours truly forgot to press record. So there's no video of that. That's why you only saw it as an audio. And I remember we had this hour-long debate on the Constitution. And then I didn't press record. And then, so then Eusebius it was cool, it was great, and I didn't even realize. And then I was like, because it was a Zoom call during COVID, and then he was like, great, yeah, send it to me, whatever, cool. And then I was like, he ended the call. And you know when the call ends and then it triggers something in your mind? Like when the call ends, then it's supposed to say recording stopped. And then I didn't hear that, and I was like, so I didn't record. And then I had to tell him that I had not recorded. And I remember being so scared because I was like, I just took an hour of your time and I didn't press record. And I remember sending this voice note like, friend. So I didn't press record on our conversation. And he could have been, angry or whatever. He just literally laughed. And he was like, cool, let's release it as a podcast. Let's just get it out there. So that's the behind the scenes on that one. Eusebius, I think, was also really interesting because as much as he criticized corruption and he criticized government, and dare I say it, the ANC government, he was a fierce critic of racism as well. Because I think a lot of people will often criticize the government to hide that they actually have racist views. Or other people will criticize racism, but they'll defend the government. Eusebius was unique in this sense that he was a fierce critic of racism. And racism in the media. So we had a really interesting conversation where he spoke about his experiences of racism in the South African media. And we all know that the South African media has racial bias. We all know that the South African media covers certain angles from a certain white gaze. We know South African newsrooms, the senior ranks of private newsrooms are often disproportionately white and male. And Eusebius wasn't scared to talk about that. So listen to this story of how he navigated. On the one hand, when you're in media, you make enemies of very powerful people. But then on the other hand, you also have to make enemies of your bosses sometimes because they don't understand the racial dynamics, or they're just being flat out racist themselves. So you're fighting corrupt politicians, but now you're fighting a racist boss at the same time. And how do you navigate that within the space of South African media? I think it was really interesting on that. So let's take a listen to that clip. What are some of the experiences that you've had that have caused you to see the salience and the importance of race in the South African media?
It's a really, really important question. And I've reflected on it because your platform is so important and the issue is so important that I didn't want to just shoot from the hip. I think firstly, the one thing that struck me early on is the narrative framing that you also spoke about in the first installment of this series, that our media renders people of color, black people, brown people, invisible. And that even when newsrooms have a numerical majority of staff that are black, it doesn't necessarily mean that the legacy of white supremacy within the South African media, like the rest of society, have been eliminated. So the one thing that has always struck me is how if you produce journalism or propose to produce journalism that is pro-poor, that is pro-social justice, that is critical of various forms of hegemony, that you are immediately marked out as some sort of maverick, which is weird because in a country like ours, you would think that having a even explicit bias in favor of telling the stories of black people, of working class people, people living under conditions of poverty, that you have an obvious basic duty as a journalist to do so because that's the experience that is default for the vast majority of citizens. I think my first sort of systemic encounter with the ways in which racism as well as class hegemony plays out within the South African newsroom is how you come up against and you get marked out as being something of a maverick, controversial Sizwe, controversial Eusebius, and all you're really doing is asking tough questions about neoliberal economics, about consensus around orthodox economics, around whether or not, the state is truly the only actor responsible for corruption. What about non-state actors? You ask those questions and suddenly you come up against forces that don't like it.
When I first heard you, I thought you were white. And actually, even though, as you say, and as we know, there are more and more black voices in the media, there's a difference between having black journalists and having black voices who adopt an authoritative voice on a topic and are capable of swaying opinion on a topic. And And so representation is not just about having more Black journalists, it's about having more Black journalists of authority who are both themselves prepared to assume the authoritative voice and who have a readership or an audience that believes it. And it's actually, when you think about it, that's still very, very rare in the South African media landscape.
You've nailed it. One of the themes that you and I wanted to explore is representation. And when I thought about that, I thought there's two parts to that. One question is diversity conducive to changing narratives that are one-dimensional? I think the answer is yes, but it depends on whether, if you get more minorities, Black people, women in the newsroom, whether you give them sufficient power to be truly included in strategic decisions and in what the final copy is that goes to print. Because you can have Black editors that we've had for many years now, the Sunday Times, Sunday World, EP Herald, Black Woman even, Sowetan, the Daily Dispatch, and some of them have done well. I don't want to take pot shots at them. And some of them have done less well. And some of them are good examples of cosmetic changes where you haven't seen discursive change just because you've had a leadership change at the helm. And that speaks to your point. Some of them were just not strong in terms of leadership and personality and weren't ready for it. Others came up against challenges. Some left. I mean, you take someone like Songezo, absolutely brilliant. I think he should write a full book in which he tells us what truly happened at the day, but it's very clear that he was too independent-minded in some way. I mean, can you imagine me being an editor or deputy editor of a place like Financial Mail or Business Day? I mean, I would have passed 5 minutes. I probably wouldn't even be approached. If I were to be an editor of a newspaper, it would have to be a paper like the Mail and Guardian, where there's already a coincidence of ideological beforehand. But your point is absolutely spot on. And what I do want to say, at the risk of being controversial, which shouldn't be unlike me, is that there's also a way in which some white people who are in control of the money condescend to Black readers, viewers, and listeners by making certain Black appointments insincerely, hoping to pull the wool over the eye of the public, but secretly knowing that actually this person is weak, either technically weak, ideologically weak, or they can effectively be controlled. And I'm not saying that Black journalists can't think for themselves. There are many Black journalists who are excellent, including some excellent editors who are Black. But there's also, let's be honest, a certain kind of Black writer, commentator that have their careers sponsored by a white liberal. There are, many a Black journalist and Anton Harber, who'd proudly, when he retires one day, say, I groomed so-and-so. This person I took under my wings. And I'm always scared when white liberal media elders talk about their favorite Black journalists.
It's also about, when I think of these subscription models now that are becoming, all the rage, is it much better if you just have a bunch of rich white subscribers and you serve them what they want all the time? Is that really serving the public interest? Or is it serving a very skewed subscriber who comes from a very specific perspective interest?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant observation. And that is why I'm so thrilled that this series is a partnership and a multi-year one, because I was saying just yesterday to mostly private sector attendees of a conference where I did a keynote, right at the end of it, people always want to know practically, now that you've scared us about the state of our democracy, what the hell can we actually do, you see this?
Yeah.
The shopping list of easy to-dos, and there are no easy to-dos for fixing our country's myriad problems, as you know as well as I do.
Mm.
But one of the things I often say to capitalists is, listen, if you finally, appropriately, feel a bit guilty about either your collusion with the state in terms of stealing from society, or your culpable silence, not speaking out against your own, against the likes of McKinsey, or not speaking out against the state because you want tenders. Here's some things you can do, even if you do it secretly. And one of the things you need to do is to give money to independent critical journalism, precisely so that platforms like this one, projects that I want to still do, platforms like New Frame and Ground Up, can produce journalism that can be read without being paid for. Because the alternative, is that it becomes prohibitive to access it. And it also means that you have a polity, you've got public discourse that simply is not genuinely democratic. All the things that I in philosophy and you in politics theorized about what kind of society ideally do you want to live in, a deliberative democracy, depends on a diverse group of participants in the public debate. And there's way too much journalism that is exclusionary. Most of the people who will engage you and I are either going to be professional journalists, or it's going to be part of the money classes. And although I think even if our language frameworks are a bit complex in this conversation, there is a poor critique of the media in our discussion. Of course, the people that we are hoping to inscribe into the conversation are not going to be accessing this platform. And that is a massive problem. I see that even with my beloved Mail and Guardian. I love the Mail and Guardian as a columnist for them and as one of the main writers. But if you go onto the letters pages, the editor receives letters, ironically enough, from people who probably regard themselves as incredibly progressive English-speaking white liberal South Africans, who get mightily pissed off about things that you and I would regard as trite when it comes to, just a simple little column explaining white privilege. And I think I was like, oh my God, if this is what the average white, or not necessarily the average, but this is what a white English-speaking, self-styled, progressive, liberal reader of mine thinks, what about the reader of The Citizen or News 24? And what complicates it is that I'm only reaching a certain portion of readership, which is precisely to your point. And I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Because it seems when we do media for Black people, we also banalize Black people, and I confess to be hypocritical. Take a channel like Moja Love, I'm addicted to it. But it also says that genuinely Black-owned media sometimes also are very reductive in their depictions of Black life, which is equally problematic.
Yeah, we're in a bind, and I don't think we've got to the point yet in South Africa where we have a significant number of independent, anti-racist and various forms of oppression and bigotry. And I include here, politics that recognizes queer people, of course, politics of gender justice as well. On the one hand, that takes representation seriously as well. But on the other hand, is also excellent at journalism, at exposing corruption, at in a nuanced way, holding a corrupt state that happens to have a number of Black leaders feet to the fire. And for me, we all need to think about how do we build that, because we're just not there. We're just not there yet. And we all know it. We all feel a sense of frustration about the landscape and how it depicts what we know is wrong. It's like we know the country is messed up, but we also know the way we're receiving how messed up the country is messed up.
Yeah, in ways that's interesting. If we come back to the journalism, you made a point in our WhatsApp chat the other day that resonated with me, and I think it generalizes to not just journalism, but across our society. There are certain complexities that, as a result of what you've just described, are lost. I was saying on Twitter and Facebook the other day that we get rightly, some of us anyway, triggered by people who falsely compare apartheid South Africa to post-apartheid South Africa.
Sure.
And the analogy runs out very quickly because the differences run deep. But the consequence of us pushing back against a racist who insists that the two times of history are similar, the consequence of that is that we sometimes let this ANC government off the hook.
Yeah.
And there are very few journalism platforms.
Or the EFF for that matter.
Exactly. Where, as you put it, we need to explain and push back against this false dichotomy that if you are anti-racist, that you must be very generous in your depiction of the ANC-led state, and that's absolute BS. So there's a lot of complexity that is lost, and part of the problem is also the juniorization, quite apart from the racism history and the hegemonies that we flagged early in this conversation. If you don't have enough gravitas, either because you're an academic who came into journalism, you transposed your skill set, or just because you put in the hours, you've been in the field, you've earned your time, and now you can really write excellent news analyses, reportage, and essays for me to read on a Sunday morning. There isn't that kind of complexity, and that's a real shame. So we also have a quality problem, quite apart from a racism problem, Sizwe. We also have just a quality problem. When you go onto 702 or any radio station, it's like going into someone's house, and almost quite literally, because many people will listen to you doing your radio show while they're inside their house or inside their car. So their connection with you is deeply personal. Now, if I come into that space and I've just been hired with my left-wing racial politics, and I tell the average 702 person to examine their views about themselves, that maybe not everything is okay. Maybe you're not as decent as you think you are. Maybe just because you're not an explicit racist doesn't mean you don't have implicit racism in you. It's the equivalent in terms of how they experience me, of me knocking on their front door and saying, Pete, let me in. I want to tell you about your white supremacy. And so it's deeply personal. And I just took the decision that I don't give a damn about whether I have a 20-year career or whether I have a 2-year career on 702 or a 5-year career. I want to be remembered for centering conversations dialectically that try and dig so that we can get at the truth about the history of colonialism and racism in our country, what it has done to all of us, black and white people, how it manifests in the present, and to both educate and to challenge and to debate and frame debates, and do so because I think that is what good broadcasters should do. And what helps, if I can distill all of that muddled responses, is that at the heart of that decision was a refusal to be obsessed with popularity. So people say, you know what, you see, I don't always like you, but you were appointment listening. I prefer that to someone liking me uncritically. Never aspired to be a Simonier presenter or to be a top-billing presenter who is gorgeous with a six-pack, no one hates you. But quite frankly, what are you leaving behind the morning after you're dead? What will people you remember you for? And for me, it was important to say truth and dialectic is far more important than popularity. And I'd far rather someone respect me than like me, or even worse, they are unmoved by my journalism.
Yeah, so I think Eusebius, the best way to remember him is to revisit his ideas, to revisit the things he said. I think we should go back to his books, 3 of which he published, revisit those ideas now, but also revisit the kinds of things he said in public, not just on SMWX, but in many places, and make sure that we preserve the archive of his thought to spark debate, to create productive disagreement, but also to pay tribute to a brilliant young black South African in the democratic era who did things that hadn't been done before and who paved a way for many, like me in the media space, who came after him. So my sincerest sympathies to all those who watched Eusebius. Of course, I've conveyed my sympathies to those close to him, but I do so again here. And may Eusebius Mkhwanazi rest in peace. Spread the fire. Welcome back to part 2 of my exclusive interview with Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwanazi, South Africa's public protector. Thanks so much for joining us, Advocate Mkhwanazi. We began in part 1 by establishing the facts of the case, looking at some of the evidence that you had at your disposal that led you to your conclusions. I want to now look at some of the wider implications of your report. And the first question I want to ask is, how do you see the legal standing of this report? Subject to a challenge, do you believe that a mere review application would constitute enough legal weight to suspend your remedial action, for example, as has happened in other cases? The Minister Gordhan and Pillay dispute is a case in point.
I think that we have clarified and we've even informed the President that mere lodging of a review application doesn't suspend the remedial action. The highest court of the land, the Constitutional Court, pronounced on this. Lodging a review, in fact, they said the remedial action of the public protector is binding until set aside by a court. So only lodging a review, I mean, everyone can just frivolously lodge a review just to frustrate the work of the public protector. But then what we normally then say, interdict the implementation.
Right.
Because then it will suspend the implementation of the remedial action.
So that would be the only way that the President, let's say within the 30-day notice where you've asked the Speaker, the NDPP and the Commissioner of Police to act, the only way that that deadline would be held is if there's a successful interdiction of the implementation.
Yes. Actually, he then interdicting the implementer.
Right.
To implement.
So he would implement those, interdict those 3 parties
who are supposed to implement.
Right.
So that's the only way, and again, is depending on whether the court will grant that. And if not, then those who are expected to implement should be implementing the remedial action.
What do you have to say again to the wider implications of this, to those who say that you've been selective in your investigations?
I wonder why they're saying that. Unfortunately, even my predecessor was sometimes accused of being selective or of choosing certain investigations. EMIA is very clear, Executive Members Ethics Act. It says the public protector is the only institution which can investigate this, and then we should be finalizing our investigations within 30 days. And if we are not going to do that, inform the President if it's about the Minister, or inform the Premier if it's about the MEC. In this instance, we had to inform the Speaker because we couldn't finalize this investigation within 30 days. And it's lodged by members of Parliament strictly. Hence, we are operating this political space. I think you've seen being accused that I'm now in a political or a certain faction. But I'm doing my work without fear, favor. I'm not even involved in that. I'm discharging my duties. So in this particular issue, I had to investigate, and it doesn't give me a discretion. The Public Protector Act does give me discretion not to investigate court decisions, not to investigate matters which have been lodged 2 years after happening, unless there are special circumstances. And as well, those special circumstances, I use my discretion. So on this one, we had 7 months delay. So I wonder what would be the reasoning behind accusing us of choosing certain investigations.
Well, it does seem to me that a few years ago there was a great stampede to ensure that the remedial action of the public protector was seen as binding. Suddenly, in very similar circumstances, there's a backtracking on that position. Do you think that there are double standards in the way that you are being attacked?
Yeah, definitely. I think South Africans should learn now that you cannot legislate or you cannot issue a decision or a judgment to deal with the person. Don't play the man, but play the ball. This should be a lesson because the remedial action of the public protector is binding, and it's the Constitutional Court. If it was possibly the High Court, would say, possibly the Constitutional Court, but the Constitutional Court, we are a constitutional state. The Constitution is very clear. So it said the remedial action is binding. And there are other judgments in the Pretoria High Court, especially about the establishment of the state capture inquiry, some of the issues which were raised there, saying the observations also are binding.
As you mentioned that across the political spectrum, from Minister Gordhan to you, public scrutiny is a very difficult thing to deal with personally. I've also seen this up close in my family. What has it been like to be at the center of such a political storm, to be vilified in many ways, and also to be criticized quite deeply in court papers, for example, which suggest that you're not executing your duties based on duty, but based on a sinister political agenda?
It has been a bumpy ride, I must say. I'm a human being also, and you look at this or what is happening, and you wonder whether if we say as a country we live in a constitutional state or a democratic country, but at the end of the day there would be people who wouldn't want to be subjected to the very same law. And sometimes you feel, okay, it means this law is only made for a certain class of people or certain race. So, sometimes then you wonder, but at the end of the day, being a constitutional institution, that's why I'm here to support and strengthen constitutional democracy and to bring sanity to others who would want to or who care to listen, to understand that the public protector is performing her responsibility without fear, favor or prejudice, and complaints are lodged. They should be investigated irrespective of your standing in society. So for me, I'm taking it as it comes, and I'm telling myself that history, when I'm judged by history, at least I would be very at peace with the fact that I've done my part. I didn't, or I was not influenced by who is who, or who's supposed to be investigated, who's not supposed to be investigated. I think I'm literally making sure that we live, we breathe this constitution.
And finally, how seriously do you think South Africans should take the findings that you made today? These are matters not just of, it seems to me, a mistaken infraction, but that go right to the heart of our constitution and right to the heart of Parliament and the role of the president in our country. How seriously do you take this report?
I take this report very seriously because I indicated to the South Africans also when I was publishing the report that we shouldn't be seen to be choosing or accusing people without evidence. I have evidence in my possession, and when you are a leader of the country, especially the president, he needs to lead by example. And when he started also, he said we need a clean governance. We don't need the state to be captured or the state of capture. We don't need families who will then receive favors from government contracts and tenders or even influence the state or the leader of the country, especially the president, in taking decisions. Now, this investigation has revealed the evidence which shows that if you are a person or a company donating to a person's campaign, and in this particular instance, I mean, we have this judgment which was brought by the case brought by Right to Know at the Constitutional Court, where they wanted the political parties to even reveal who are their donors. So it's the very same reason that we need transparency. We don't need people to be influenced, because when then I'm able to give you money, surely I do have certain expectations. And in this particular instance, I mean, if you have so much money, I mean, 51 million, 39 million.
And these were just single donations of over 50 million.
Yes, and it's a lot. Others is 5 million, others is 500,000, but it's a lot of money. So it's concerning that you'll have then individuals and families and companies. Well, then there's a lot of potential risk of state of capture, because it means those people can dictate how the country should be run, and dictate who should be minister, who shouldn't be minister, who should be head of any institution in the country.
Well, Advocate Mkhwanazi, thank you so much for your time and for joining all of the subscribers of SMWX. We really appreciate you dedicating some time, particularly for a youth audience.
Thank you.
And I'm delighted today to be joined by South Africa's Public Protector, Advocate Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Advocate Mpofu-Walsh, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Yeah, welcome. And good afternoon or evening to your listeners as well.
Thank you so much. You explained in painstaking detail the context of this report, so I'm not going to go back over that. I want to get straight into your findings, how you came to them, and what the implications are, because I think they're quite serious.
Yeah. On receipt of a complaint from the leader of the opposition, Mr. Maimane, the complaint was lodged in terms of the Executive Members Ethics Act.
Right.
It's only members of parliament who can lodge that complaint.
Right.
And also against the executive. The executive meaning the president, the premier, the ministers, the MECs. So, and also the member of the EFF, the deputy president of the EFF, also lodged a complaint. So we received a complaint in November, the other one in November 2018, the other one in January 2019. So the complaint was about whether the president has misled Parliament.
Right.
Because at first he responded to a follow-up question by Mr. Maimane about the relationship his son has with the African Global Organization and former Busasa. So he said, no, he spoke to his son at close range and discussing the matter, and the son assured him that everything is above board. But on our investigation then, in fact, before the complaint was lodged, the president corrected his reply and said, no, actually it's not, the money was not deposited into my son's account, but it was deposited into CR17 campaign. So we conducted the investigation. I've indicated how we conduct our investigation, what happened, what should have happened, the prescripts, and how then to balance the two or to remedy whatever has happened. So in this particular instance, then we've discovered that, when engaging the president was very cooperating in the investigation, I must say, and he indicated that he felt attacked by Mr. Maimane when he said his family might be involved in corruption or any conflict of interest. So we then determined 3 issues,
Right.
because it was also the issue of the 500,000 which was donated, and the alleged or suspicion of money laundering, because the money was moving from one account to another account before the final recipient. So our investigation then revealed that indeed the president misled Parliament, because he's a constitutional being, and he should have made sure that if he was not sure about the information, especially because the question was relating to VBS, the one he prepared to respond to. Now the follow-up is relating to Bosasa and the Sun.
Right.
He should have requested to go back and prepare properly. And also not because he was saying he felt attacked. I mean, as a president, you should be displaying that level of, being a constitutional being and taking things with the, not with whims and just react on a spur of a moment.
Can I ask you on that, on the question of misleading? Because I'd also like to come to the 2 other questions. But in your briefing, you said that you had evidence in your possession, not only that he didn't prepare, but also that it seems as though he knew some of the runnings of the campaign. Can you take us through what the nature of that evidence is that brought you to those conclusions?
That relates then to the monies which were paid into these accounts, because the money from Bosasa was paid into EFG2. So now the EFG2 account was used to then transfer all the monies out to either Reatenda trust account or to the this linked environment account. Now the evidence we have before even requesting him to provide additional evidence, because he was saying he said, I don't want to know what's happening, and even the campaign's team was saying we were not going to disclose anything, but strangely he attended the dinners, he addressed the donors, so there's correspondence, email from the campaign's managers to him about the monies which needs to be transferred to the Cyril Ramaphosa Foundation.
So there's correspondence actually linking the money flow with the the deputy president at the times.
Now he was now a president.
Oh, by then.
Yes, some of the transactions happened after he was the president. Because some started in 2016 December, others started January 2017, to February 2018. In fact, I'm not sure whether he was now the president, but then the movement of monies happened between 2016 December and February 20. Some of the accounts February 2019, but also there is information where they were saying to him, can you approach so and so, for donations and
So in terms of this question of the flow of money, which is another arm of your report and an aspect of your findings which relates to questions of money laundering, it seems as though you also have evidence in your possession, or could you tell us the kind of evidence that you have which demonstrates not simply that money reached the destination, but the way that it reached the destination happened in an improper manner? And in particular, you mentioned certain campaign donations that you were able to track, and I just wanted a bit more clarity on what that evidence looks like.
Well, it's deposits which were made into these 3 accounts. Because you have this EFG2 account, then there's a trust which is opened, and then there's another company which is opened. So some money moves from EFG2 to this trust account to this private company, but some monies will then move directly from EFG2 to this account. So the way the monies were moving and the deposits into the accounts. Hence, I'm saying that the evidence I'm having can be utilized by NPA and prosecutions to determine whether anyway there's any crime related elements which are there.
Then again, I think one of the interesting distinctions which you made, which perhaps hasn't been adequately reflected on, is this question of a conflict between private interests and public duty. And you made it quite clear in your report that that conflict doesn't actually have to materialize, but that the mere risk of that conflict constitutes an infraction. How did you come to the conclusion that there was sufficient, at least, risk in the conflicts between private advantage and public duty?
I mean, the president was the deputy president by then. And the Executive Members Ethics Act and the code is very clear. And Section 96 of the Constitution, that members of the executive should not expose themselves to a risk. Therefore, by agreeing that we should have this CR17 campaign, we will receive donations, we will tell donors, no, don't expect anything. You are exposing yourself to that risk, and to that conflict. Now, the conflict might have materialized in this instance because now you are also participating in also facilitating that money be transferred into the various accounts. So it's very clear, legally, that the Constitution says don't expose yourself. The code says refrain from exposing yourself. I think we've issued several. The test is very minimal. The test doesn't say prove the conflict. The test says the risk of a conflict. So he should have made sure that he refused to be involved in the process, or even his name be used for campaigning.
Is there any possibility in your mind that the current president simply didn't know, or that these things happened under his watch, but he was not in a position to really know what was happening?
Before the investigation, I was thinking like that. But now the report and the investigation and the evidence I'm having shows that he knew. He was a part of the process of sourcing money and also requesting that monies be transferred from one account to another.
Thanks for watching the